Hello, everybody, and welcome to Beyond the Basics, Episode 1. This is a first in another brand new series of content that we're going to be starting off here at StatCheck, going a little bit more in depth into some of the general theory and processes behind being pretty good at Warhammer. This is a series that's aimed at kind of when you're at the point where you know what you're doing with 40k and you're starting to think about the whys and the hows, and you really want to focus on improving your own game and improving the ways that you approach you know playing Warhammer. This episode is called The Right Questions to Ask Before the Game. It's split into two sections. The first section is going to be questions that you should be asking your opponent. So we'll be going through some introductions to the questions that you should be asking. Some of them will be questions that you'll ask every time. Some of them will be questions that you should be asking, like of your opponent's army, not necessarily directly to them, but things that you should be aware of in their army, which over time you'll become, less reliant on your opponent for that information. You'll kind of know it yourself, but the things to double check with yourself to make sure that you are aware of them. And then the second half of the episode is going to be about questions that you should ask yourself. So things that you should be sitting down and going, do I have a thought on this before you launch into, kicking off the game? This game should launch basically up to everything from, showing up at the table, whether that's at your local club night when you just showed up to play against the person you scheduled to a tournament round when you've just seen your opponent's list on Best Coast pairings, you've read it, you've introduced yourself. We're now at that stage of the game, and it should run through to just about everything up to and including putting your first model down on the table. With that said, let's move on to the first slide. And I'm going to need to move my head to there. Nope, that's not what we want to do. There we go. Okay, so we have questions to ask your opponent. So obviously, I'm not just going to do man read slide. I'm going to kind of run through the whys and what to do with this information as well. So questions to ask your opponent. And if I come up with any more, I'll add them as we go, because this is a brand new format that I am learning on the fly. So first question that you should be asking is, what is your opponent's threat ranges? What are their important units, and how far do they move? How far do they shoot? Where can they get to? You're going to sit down, you're going to look at your table, you're going to go, if my opponent was to put a shooting unit here, how far does it reach? If it moves 10 and shoots 24, it's got a 34-inch threat range. So you should sit down and go, if my opponent was to put their tank here, it can move to here. Therefore, anything in this line of sight along this range is in threat. What you do with that information is you then get to make a risk analysis. For any given unit, are you comfortable with your opponent putting that unit there? If no, then you should be marking off that space mentally as somewhere that you are not willing to put units while your opponent has not dropped that data sheet. You have things like charge ranges. If your opponent is going to disembark from a transport, move forward 6 inches, advance 6 inches, and charge 12, they have a 27-inch threat range. If you are not comfortable with taking a risk of that order, then you need to be more than 27. You need to be more than 27 inches away from the furthest point of their deployment zone that unit could reasonably be. These are the questions that you want to just start getting used to. Where can my opponent's stuff get to? Am I okay with it being there? If you take your 500 point, beautifully painted brand new Baneblade, you stick it on the line, your opponent goes down and puts their Eradicators 24 inches away from it, goes first, walks forward 6 inches and shoots you, you have no one to blame but yourself. Now, was that a calculated risk? Was that the right play given the situation? Entirely possible, right? That's entirely reasonably a thing that you could do, but you can't do it and be surprised when it happens. Next, we have kind of three similar questions. Who's attaching to what? What's in each transport and what's in reserve? These kind of all just bulk into the same thing. They're all done kind of at different stages of deployment before you get to the point of putting units down. You should aim to know what your opponent's got where. What's inside each venom. How are they marked? What have they got in each venom? What characters are attached to what units? What characters are those in? How are they splitting? If they've got things like venoms, immolators, any unit that splits in half, how are they splitting them? These are things that people have subtle variations across different armies, and you should be aware of the different ways that your opponent is going to do that. Now, for some of them, it's going to be super obvious. Things like Dominion squads in Sisters of Battle right now, you should expect it's going to be the Sergeant and four of the special weapons, and then the Simulacrum Imperialis and 4 others. But if your opponent diverges from that, it would be useful information to have. So you should ask these questions, whether that's by looking at your opponent's tray and recognizing that they're split into units of that already, in which case you maybe don't need to ask them directly, but you should be aware of these kind of things. Especially as we see more armies like Dark Angels Gladius in the metagame right now. I don't want to date these too much metagame wise, but right now we have some armies that are fairly hop swappy with leaders. You might have Azrael attaching to an inner circle companion squad in one unit in one game, and then an assault squad in another. And depending on where they do that, you will react to those units differently. So you should be aware of these things. Just double check, make sure. Grey Knight Librarians, are they attaching or are they going solo? If there are Terminator squads and Drago, like how are they splitting it? These are all things that will impact your decision making process during your deployment. You should know what your opponent's threats are to you, not just their threat ranges, but also what each respective unit could do. Now, what units break core game rules is a fairly broad question, but what it mostly means is what units can do something that is not just move, shoot, fight, move, shoot, charge, right? What units can go back into reserve? That's a really big one right now. Kaladin's Assassins, Scout Squad, Swooping Hawks, Mandrakes, Vaveners, and Tyranids. All of these things are units that break a core game rule of they are where they say they are, and then suddenly they are not. Which units have sticky objectives? What units don't need to have the core game rule of being on an objective to have held it? What units can advance and shoot? What units can advance and charge? What units can get back into transports? Anything that would be a surprise if it happened, right? Like, every unit you should expect can Overwatch. Which units have flamers, right? Might be a thing that you are interested in for your specific army. You should know what of your opponent's units have a fundamental interaction in a way that you are not expecting. This might for you be reactive moves if you're playing a melee army. It might be, um, there's the new Imperial Agent strategy for reactive moving after being shot strategy that you might really care about as a Tau gunline. All these kind of things. Anything that breaks a core game rule that affects you specifically, but also just generally which units break core rules. It is almost always going to be very, very important to know this. So yeah, get in the habit of asking questions about which of your opponent's units ignore the core tenets of playing Warhammer and do something else. This will also include things like detachment abilities, stratagems, anything like that. Hypercrypt has a bunch of units that can go back in reserve. You should probably know army wide, and then also which ones have deep strike and which ones have strategic reserve. If you know this by looking, great. If you don't, go and have a look at their data sheets on the app, or ask your opponent. Right, like, these are things that you want to know because they will affect your planning, they will affect how you deploy, and the question that you're going to be asking yourself when we get to that in a second. Now, how do you handle marking certain things is another one that I think is really important to bring up with like certain types of games. Knowing if your opponent counts up or down with wound counters, knowing how they mark battle shock tests. How do they mark what's in a transport? Do they put the dude on top of it, or is it you might find that your opponent's playing Venoms that have a bunch of models like already embarked on them. And it's really difficult to tell what's going on, so they put the model next to it, right? There are as many different ways to do this as there are Warhammer players. It's always worth double checking with your opponent just what their system is. Do you mark wounds? How do you mark squads? Right, if your opponent's playing six squads of Termagants, it'd be really good to know how they're being told apart. Some people use loom bands, some people use things like this, some people use the direction the models are facing, or in one particular egregious case, the pose of the models, right? If you have 3 squads of Death Shroud, you can have all the ones that are one pose, all the ones that are other, because there's only 3 poses of Death Shrouds. You got 3 squads of 3, well, then you have three sets of identical poses, right? Which one's the sergeant? How do I tell, right? All these kind of things. If you don't ask these questions, you are vulnerable to getting caught out mid-game by something that you weren't expecting. Oh, that dude's not part of that squad, he's actually part of that one. It's impossible to know if your opponent is being fair or if your opponent is making a mistake if you are not paying attention to this thing. So ask the question, get an answer. If your opponent doesn't have a way to tell it apart, maybe consider finding one. I would recommend having things like a notepad at the tournament to make things like order tokens for guard players. If you opponent, how do they mark orders? Oh, I don't. Well, I'm really sorry, but how am I meant to know what's going on, right? How am I meant to remember what's got +1 to C, right? Like, it's unfair for your mental load to put that much on yourself. So ask the questions. The last one that I really want to cover is how do we handle intent and cocked dice, and all those kind of general order things. And this is one of those questions that you hear bandied about a lot of tournament play. For most people, what intent is if you say that you are going to do something, so I'm going to roll this charge, or hey, I'm this distance away, I'm moving 6 directly towards you. What's my charge? Right? That would be the proper way to phrase it. I get my unit. I'm going to disembark at 3 inches from this transport. I'm going to move 6 inches forward. What is the distance from this transport to that unit? I'm going to move 9 inches of my own free will. Okay, we are 17 inches apart. That means across my advance and my charge, I need to combine total of 8. I'm going to disembark. I'm going to roll my advance. And then when you come back to the models, you leave like a token there or a marker or whatever, and you put down, this is a 5. And you come back to it, and if those models are somehow 7 inches apart because you forgot or like a model got knocked, you guys know that was a 5-inch charge. You declared the intent. The intent was to be 5 away to make that charge as short as possible. Or, hey, I'm putting these guys down 9 away, and then you just dump the models, and you're like, I'll fix them after the charge or whatever. Or, hey, I'm going to charge onto this objective in your movement phase, and then you come back and, oh, you forgot to do it. Oh, well, you declared, like, declared intent, right? There's degrees of that. I want to be behind this sight line, right? You measure the line between two pieces of terrain. You tell your opponent, hey, if you move maximum distance towards this direction, I believe that you can't see here. Through this line, I'm behind that line where you could see. Your opponent verifies. Between the two of you, you have declared intent. Is your opponent comfortable with doing this? Do they want to play things as they lie? There is. It's really easy to play like weaponized intent, I think is one thing that people bring up, right? Which is saying, oh, well, it was obvious that I was going to do this. I think there's a time and a place for that. And that's another conversation you can have, right? Implied intent is a much more difficult conversation where it's worth having your opponent. How comfortable are you with mild takebacks? Oh, I forgot to move this guy onto this objective to do my cleanse. Do you mind if I do that? Right? That's kind of implied intent. It was obvious that I would have done this. Um, and everybody's line where that will lie somewhere else. And it is always worth verifying with your opponent where theirs is before the game to avoid any field bats. If you know your opponent is going to hold you to that standard, you can make your own decision about whether to hold them to that standard. And you are less likely to be caught out and irritated when it happens. The same thing kind of applies, I would suggest, with chess clocks. Are we playing death clocks this game, where if we time out, the game is over, or are we playing, wishy washy? I'll give you some of my time at the end, which is an entirely reasonable thing that some people do, but also avoid the feels bad in advance. And then the last one, yeah, the same thing with cocked dice. Are you playing with a dice tray? If the dice bounces out of the tray, are you playing it as it stands? Are you only rolling in the tray? Is a dice there are as many ways to play cocked dice as there are players of 40k. I've played everything from if it's not flat on the table, right? Whether it's even if it's flat on a terrain piece, it rerolled. It has to be flat on the mat. I've played only in the dice tray. I've played in the dice tray, but if it bounces out and it's flat, it's fine, right? There are hundreds of different ways to do this. I would strongly recommend, as always, discuss this with your opponent before it becomes a problem, because the last thing you want is to roll a double six charge and then your opponent to go cocked on you, and then you to just be like, oh, I kind of have to because like that's how I've been playing it, or that's how they've been playing it, right? You never want you to feel like you're being bullied, never want to feel like you're bullying your opponent, anything in the in between. Just get the discussion out of the way, handle this conversation with your opponent at the beginning of the game, before any of this goes on. Now you might find that you're playing a tournament that has declared rules for this or doesn't or whatever. Same thing with like sharing dice, a lot of 40k players have like a big bag of dice that are all mixed and humble jumbled, and they are dice from this country and this club and that club and this tournament that I went to, and you've got the same thing, and you both throw up to the table, you put your bag down, and at the end of the game, nobody can tell whose dice are whose anymore. So you might just be like, hey, can we just play with one bag of dice? Hey, can we play with both of you? Do we have stream dice, right? Anything of these orders, have the conversation. If your opponent's not comfortable with you rolling their dice, ask why. If it's the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, understandable. If it's right now, also understandable. But why, right? Like, does your opponent have dodgy dice? Do you have dodgy dice? Can you not tell what any of your opponent's dice are, right? Have the conversation about all of this intent kind of thing at the beginning of the game, and it avoids ever having uncertain circumstances. Now, none of these questions have to be like particularly onerous. Getting your opponent to run through their army is a fairly standard thing, especially if you don't have a lot of familiarity with it. And the more you learn about the game, the more you have a good understanding of what each army does, the less some of these questions will matter, right? A lot of the time, I'll ask threat ranges to confirm them with myself more than to like get my opponent. I'll just be like, hey, your threat range is 27, right? More to verify than anything else, because that's the point where your opponent would offer up a stratagem that you hadn't remembered, or that, oh no, just remember this squad has the enhancement that gives +2 move or anything like that. That's probably another one that's very quickly worth targeting on. Is it characters with enhancements? Which one has it? How do I tell which is which? If your opponent has 3 Chaos Lords and one of them has Dread Reaver, it'd be really helpful to know which one is the Dread Reaver. Same thing applies to any given character in the game where your opponent has multiples and one of them has an enhancement and one of them doesn't. How can I tell them apart? Is there an easy way to do that, or is that enhancement liable to jump around between the game? These are also, for what it's worth, questions you should ask yourself. How do you mark these things? How do you handle people being able to tell which ones of your squads are, right? These are all things you should prepare before the tournament, but your opponent is definitely going to be able to ask you these questions, and you should have a viable answer for all of them. Okay, I'm going to move on to questions to ask yourself. These are a little bit more high concept in the sense that they are not questions that you will be directly asking, but things you want to be thinking about. And these will all affect how you approach deployment and the things that you will do during them. And again, I'm going to go through what the question is and why it's a thing you should be thinking about and how to use that information. So, am I advantaged in this game? It's a really important thing to ask at the beginning of the game is, do you think you are going to be implicitly ahead by way of the mission you're playing, the matchup you're playing, being better than your opponent, skill wise, any number of things could apply to giving you an advantage in the game. It is important to know Do you have that advantage or not? Now, people get this wrong all the time, and that's fine. There's no perfect understanding of whether a list beats another list or whether a player should beat another player. But knowing where you lie should help inform your risk tolerance for the game. If you're advantaged, you are one of two kinds of player. You are either a player who pushes advantages, who looks for risks and takes bigger ones while ahead to try to double down, or you are a player who tries to minimize risk when behind and tries to create a controlled and stable game state where you maintain an advantage. But if you're and then when you're disadvantaged, the same thing kind of applies. Are you a player who tries to create a stable game to prevent disadvantage from furthering, or are you a player who tries to make the game volatile and takes bigger risks while behind? You should know which kind of player you are. For each of those spectrums, there is high volatility while ahead, low volatility while behind, high volatility while ahead, high volatility while behind, all these kind of things, right? Like there's the four quadrants, you will fall somewhere along those spectrums. Maybe you're very close to the middle, it doesn't matter too much for you. Maybe you're very close to one extreme. You should probably have an understanding of what kind of game you think this should be. Is it a high volatility game for you? Is it a low volatility wait for mistakes? If you're going into a bad matchup and you think that you are a player that likes to take big risks, and it turns out that it's a good matchup and you like to take small risks while you're ahead, you're going to be really upset with yourself when you take a big risk, it doesn't pay off, and you lose from an advantage state or a disadvantage state, right? So try to have a decent understanding of what you're expecting out of this game. The next kind of thing is, do you want to go first or second? Under almost any circumstances, you should have a preference. There are very, very few times where this is exactly close to the middle, like 45-55 out of the way. You should have a preference for this. What that generally means is that you should be aiming to think about deployment from the perspective of the side you are less preferenced to. Right now in Pariah Nexus, a great example for this is going second tends to be really good because of things like secret missions and endgame primary scoring and all these kind of things that fall into that order. How much are you willing to risk on going second being better? Now, what that can often mean in deployment is doing things like deploying a couple of units significantly more aggressively in order to take advantage of the first turn roll if you happen to win it, because you'll be so happy to go second that you're okay with taking a small risk for that. If you're very, very excited about going first, then you should consider putting maybe some more stuff in rapid ingress to have a solid counter threat if you go second, right? Things like that. There are tools available to you for both of these eventualities. If you have a strong preference one way or the other, and you can maintain most of that preference while hedging against the other, start thinking about ways to do that during deployment. Can you know, preserve drops to counter deploy an important unit to minimize your opponent's advantage from going first? Can you put more units in reserve than you otherwise would in order to minimize your threat of going first and having nothing to do, or going second and being completely blown out by a world pushing you super aggressively, right? Like you are only able to you were able to make the most decisions about the impact of the game before deployment, right? Your units move infinite before deployment within your deployment zone. So get it right as much as you can. The next question is, how do you want to interact with each objective on the board? So objectives are the primary way that we score points in 40K, right? Primary. It's almost like that's why it's called that. I think that's a terrible joke. You should have a vague understanding or a very strong understanding of how each of the 5 or 6 objectives on the board impact you. Now, generally, you will have your home objective. Your game plan is to hold this for the entire game. Broadly, there are exceptions, but broadly. There is the middle objective, which is usually the one that the fighting is almost always over and it's very difficult to hold. There is your opponent's home objective, which has some level of consideration between completely ignore and push immediately with as much pressure as I can. And then you have the 2 expansion objectives. Now, your expansion objective, which is the one that's closest to your deployment zone, that's easiest for you to hold, should be a thing that you are able to identify from the terrain and the map that you're playing. You may have a different opinion of which is your expansion objective to your opponent. Have to think about which one they're going to think is their expansion objective, right? You should know which one is the one that you are aiming to score primary from without being disrupted so much, and which one your opponent is likely to do the same to. Are you planning on pressuring their primary objective? Are you planning on ignoring it? You are going to deploy with a mind to protecting yours, aggressing at theirs, or you know, aggressing at both of them, or ignoring your expansion objective and just beelining for your opponents. All of these kind of things will be based on whether you think you are going to try to make this game about primary or not, whether you think it's about defending yours, whether you think it's about attacking theirs. And there are all sorts of different ways to do this, and we'll be talking about some of that when we talk about the deployment side of things and the game plan. But these are the kind of things that you should be thinking about when you're going into it. Which objectives are mine? Which objectives are theirs? How do I want to impact that? Now, which units of yours are important? There are broadly two ways a unit can be important in a game of 40k. One is by being unique, and one is by being uniquely located. Unique units are ones that are the only thing that can do their job, or the best thing at doing their job, or one of a small subset of your army. If you are playing a Gladius Dark Angels list, the Eradicators are basically your only shooting unit. They are very unique. They are worth protecting in some matchups where the game is about that, and sometimes they are completely irrelevant because the game is not about them. The other side of things is uniquely positioned units that are the only thing on their side of the board, the only thing that can get to an objective, the only thing that can do an action, the only thing that can charge to your home objective. The only thing unique units are unique by virtue of where they are, not what they are. Now, they can be both, a unit can be unique and uniquely located, or, anything in between. But you should be thinking about, do I want to have units that are the only thing in this area? You might have a unit that you want to limit interaction with. You want it to be off on a side, but your opponent will be able to counter deploy that. And they can look at it and go, well, if you put that, Gladiator Lancer on the top left corner, and it can only see on these sightlines, and I just never stand a vehicle on them. Well, your unit is unique and uniquely positioned, but in a bad way. Whereas if it's controlling a middle sightline, you might find that it's impacting the game strongly. So, which of your units do you want to make important? Which of your units do you want to make unimportant? Where can you put them that does that for you? And before you even start deploying a single model, you should have an idea for which units you want to put in important spots, which units you want to put in unimportant spots, which units are screening units this game, which units are pushing units. You will have an idea for this, and you should have, a general plan during deployment for the secondary game you're playing and the primary game you're playing. What do you want to put down that can score you area denial in turn one? What about engaging off fronts? How about containment? Do you have a plan for sabotage? Can you have a plan for sabotage? You might not be able to in this mission. You might not have an army that's built for that. But if you draw those cards and you could have planned for it and you draw them and you can't score them, that's on you. You made a conscious choice or subconscious choice to not play around an option that you could have drawn, and as such have been punished for it. Now, you can complain about being unlucky that that one came up, and obviously everybody has bad beat stories in 40k. Right? It's half the fun, but you should have a general understanding that if something goes wrong and you could have countered for it and chose not to do something else, that is a risk that you took in a game of 40k. 40k is a game of risk management. You can choose not to play around every secondary card draw. You can't choose to not play around any of them, and you can't be upset when one you chose not to play around doesn't come up. Now, which units of theirs are important? It's the same kind of thing. The same thing applies. Unique or uniquely positioned tends to be the priorities. Which units is your opponent likely to want to protect? Which units is your opponent likely to want to hold their home objective with? If they have sticky units, scout units, where are the priority places that you need to be responding to? Your opponent is going to do certain things with their units. You should be thinking about, well, how do I counter deploy them? Before you touch a single model, you're counting your opponent's drops and going, my opponent has 11 drops, I have 13. That means I know my last two drops can go down without theirs. Which ones do I think they're going to put down last? Okay, which can I leave to the end of mine? And then you can start making a plan for which are going to be your early drops, which are your units that have fairly opponent agnostic game plans. I'm going to put my cultists on my home objective so I can stick here. I'm going to put my Nurglings somewhere in the midfield. But, the Nurglings going somewhere in the midfield is a much more like opponent dependent piece of information. If your opponent has a scout unit that they're going to put down as their 11th drop, you need to have a plan for getting to your 11th or 12th drop, depending on if you won the roll or not, without putting those Nurglings down, which means you have to decide which ones are priorities for you for counter deploying, which ones are counter opponents for yours to prevent. If your opponent significantly underdropped or significantly overdrops you, you have to think about how many of their units can I get through before they have to put down something priority. If you're playing a 7-drop demons list and your opponent's playing 30 drops of Genestealer cults, you're not going to get through anything before they start putting vehicles down. But if they've got 12, well, then they're only going to get through 5 before you put down the 2. So which of their units are like the least important ones that they're going to put down, right? How can you keep yourself flexible for those game plans? Which of your demons are the most like positioning dependent, right? You might find that you've got Kairos and Be'lakor and a Great and Clean one. A Great and Clean one's going to teleport, it doesn't really matter. Kairos is going to shoot, and Be'lakor kind of just wants to stand in the middle. But your Bloodthirster would love to advance and charge, and so would Shalaxi. So they're going to go fairly close to the line. They're going to try and go up opposite from something that's worth charging. So how many drops does your opponent have to put down before they put down something that's worth charging? Can you save Shalaxi to the end? Which of their units are important for you to know about where they are? You need to decide that before deployment, so you can start picking which units you want to put where, how you're going to protect your backfield, how you're going to project offense. The last question to ask here is, do you understand the mission? Um, I say this as we are a few months into the Pariah Nexus pack now, expecting our first balance update sometime soon. I'm recording this on the 15th of September. Um, I still don't think there are a lot of people who understand Burden of Trust or Terraform particularly well and have not played it enough to have a great understanding of how the mission scores or what the mission does. If that is you, you're going to a tournament that plays it. Do you understand the mission? Have you read it? Do you understand what the bonus primary condition is? All these kind of things. It's always worth double checking with your opponent. Do you have the same understanding of the mission as your opponent? Um, this includes things like, is the terrain set up correctly? If you're looking at a board and you're looking at a WC board and you suddenly look at it and you're like, this feels wrong compared to the other ones, check the measurements. Do the pregame stuff of make sure the sight lines exist as you think they should, that your objective isn't 4 inches to the side when your opponent is 6 inches back and you can hold it and they can't, or vice versa. Do you and your opponent have the same understanding of Burden of Trust? Are you both sure it's the same mission? Not saying that I've definitely had a game before where my opponent has been playing a different primary to me for at least 1 or 2 turns. And I'm definitely not saying that I've been the right or wrong side of both of those conversations, because I absolutely have played the wrong mission before. I've been the person that got it wrong. I've played different primaries to my opponents before. Played a lot of Warhammer. It happens. Double check. If you're using like a tournament that's got like a little booklet or something, like check that it's right. Um, Check your opponent has 18 tactical cards, in their deck, or 16 tactical cards if you're playing in a different pack that doesn't exist, right? Check that they have the right amount. Um, it's all just double check. Make sure you're not getting screwed over or screwing your opponent over by something that should not be included as part of the game. That's broadly my spiel on things to think about before the game starts. Questions to ask, what to look for. Check back in for episode 2 when I have the opportunity to do it. Thank you to our wonderful patrons for providing me the opportunity and giving me the idea. I'm going to shout out, I believe this was Logan Sama's idea. So thank you, Logan, for the idea for the episode. I will be continuing down this track at some point with probably deployment next, but I will be open to suggestions if you're interested in being able to have these dialogues and suggest content and do all that kind of stuff. Check out patreon.com/statcheck for a bunch more information. You can get, for $5, you get access to our Patreon, where you can have discussions with me, and you can get discount codes for our various sponsors, which are all in the description. And then also, please do check out the live YouTube show, 11 p.m. UK time every Tuesday. That is youtube.com/statcheck. You can hear many, many more random bullshits from myself, Jeremy, Anthony, Nathan, and the various other hosts, as well as all of the other shows on the network. And if you want to hear even more from me specifically, or any of the other wonderful coaches on StatCheck, you can check out stat-check.com/coaching for a bunch of information about how to grow as a 40K player. If you're interested in working with any of our coaches one-to-one, all the information is there, or you can drop us an email at coaching@stat-check.com. I believe that's all I have to plug. If you have any feedback for this episode, for the format, anything in between, feel free to drop it in the comments in Patreon or to message me on Discord or Facebook or anywhere in between. I will be more than happy to take your feedback and to do our best to continue to grow the format and StatCheck as a whole. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Blah, blah. Oh my god, I feel like I'm doing so many plugs. No, I'm stopping there. Comments, please. I thrive on positive feedback or negative feedback, but I will cry a little bit at negative feedback. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. Good luck if you're at a tournament, and I'll catch you later. I've been Ennis. Thank you very much.